Today, the 11th of September, is the anniversary of the Battle of Stirling Bridge, which took place in 1297 between the forces of Scottish patriots William Wallace and Andrew de Moray and the invading English who had come up to meet them. We are here at the foot of the Abbey Craig on which the Wallace Monument stands, and we are currently standing in the grounds where the Scottish camp would have been, just behind us here in the grounds of the university, where they met in the lead up to the battle, and where they met the messengers from the English who came across to greet them prior to the battle starting. This was it. This was Scotland facing up to their enemies in 1297. So I'm here today with Max Muir from Robert the Bruce, Genius of Bannockburn, and we're going to talk today about the Scots, where they were in 1297 and how they approached this battle with the English who had come up to meet them. So what's your thoughts, Max? How did this kick off from here?
Well, we have got a marvellous vantage point here for the Scots army who were formed up here. When you look below, we've got Stirling Castle beyond. You've got the causeway running before that. When you look at the meanderings of the River Forth and the loop to where the rugby fields now stand, you're actually seeing where the battle may have unfolded. Now, the records state that Wallace was on the Abbey Crags, which is over there to the right-hand side. He may have been up there, but there's actually a better vantage point to be gleaned here. This army had to be ready to move.
Now, before the battle kicked off, Max, there were some negotiations apparently underway at that time, weren't there?
That's right. The English had sent two friars, I believe, up, and it was very much William Wallace who took control of that meeting very quickly, and he let his thoughts be known. They came to try and secure some type of peace so that they could resolve this matter without a fight taking place. But Wallace is reported to have said, "Tell your commander that we are not here to make peace, but to do battle and liberate our kingdom. Let them come on, and we will prove this in their very beards." So Wallace in no way minced his words there, and thus Wallace sent them back with their tail between their legs, so they would have reported to Cressingham and to de Warrene that there was no chance of peace. The Scots were here to fight, and they were fighting for the freedom of their kingdom.
And in terms of the Scottish army, how many had they here on that morning?
In terms of cavalry, they likely had very little, not much over 100. But in terms of foot soldiers, with the combination of Andrew de Moray's force and Wallace's force, my personal estimation is that they could easily have had between 6,000 and 8,000 men.
And that was a significant amount which would allow them to deal with what was a professional English army.
The English were commanded by veterans. They had a battle-hardened army. The Scots, it was looked on as no more than a rabble. But de Moray's army had been very successful in the Highlands. And of course he joined up with Wallace to attack Dundee. And Wallace was in open rebellion after Lanark. And the men gathered to him because of the type of man Wallace was. He was a very charismatic leader, but he was not only charismatic, he was a leader who instilled national fervour and belief in his men, and they joined to him. So he had a spirited force of fighting men, and I've got no doubt in my mind that they were much more than the rabble that the English thought they were when they congregated here, and they were ready to face the greatest army in the world.
Because there would be a strategy required. They couldn't just turn up on the battle and hope for the best. They needed a plan, didn't they?
They needed a plan, but they also had the terrain to do it. You did not beat the English with brute force, you beat them with brains. And so there's no way this was won just by a bunch of savages or warriors who were very rudimentary in their ways. They had learned to fight. They had learned since Dunbar, where they were heavily defeated, that they had good leaders and they managed as an army to get it together very quickly. But they knew this terrain and they knew how to use it. And jointly, these two leaders got on really well. That would have been a pivotal factor in the trust of the men, in the trust in the leadership. The combination of Wallace and de Moray was in itself a force to be reckoned with, and those men were faithful to their leaders.
And that force, that substantial force of between 6,000 and 8,000 Scots, they've come from all parts of Scotland, but they have not come under the instructions of their nobles, their feudal superiors. They have come of their own free will to support de Moray and Wallace. So these are free fighting men here under their own volition to fight this battle against the English.
They're under their own volition. What's very notable here is the nobles that are not involved, the Scottish nobles that are not here. This is very much Wallace and Andrew de Moray's army. It's a combination of them both. So these men that fight for them of their own free will.
Because it's fair to say there was huge disquiet up and down the length of breadth of Scotland at the time. And the man who was to suffer later this day, Cressingham, was a hated man. The treasurer, who the Scots called the treacherer, was a hated man in Scotland because of his greed for money, the taxes imposed, and the subjugation that they've put the Scots under.
English authority, by and large, was a hated thing. From Edward down. Wallace had killed de Heselrigg, the sheriff of Lanark and Clydesdale, and butchered them in the process, so Wallace had that reputation. But Heselrigg was known to be quite a hard, brutal man. Cressingham, on the other hand, was a hated man. He was arrogant. He was a beast. He was money-oriented. He thought very little of Scotland's subjects, and he probably made that very well known as well. So they were hated figures. The national fervour and national hatred of the invader did not need stoked. These people did that on their own.
And much is said at the battle about Wallace, but de Moray himself, he was some character, wasn't he? He had been previously captured by the English and had escaped to continue his fight.
The lean is that Moray was the more experienced. Moray had been present at the Battle of Dunbar. He had been captured. He'd escaped from an English prison. He'd been captured with the Commons. But he, as I say, he spearheads the revolt in the north, and he's very successful with that. He's taken major castles. He's rounded his men up. The English are in fear now in the north. And now we come to southern Scotland, where Wallace has been on his own wrecking campaign up and down the country, attacking in open rebellion English forts. That we now have this come to a boiling point where the English have had to do something. And they've come to the gateway of the north, which is Stirling Bridge. Wallace has sent the messengers back. Now, what would happen next must have been absolutely confusing for Wallace and de Moray, for it takes not only several hours for the English to cross Stirling Bridge, but several attempts. They watch for a first time, and the army are called back. There is a delay. They watch for a second time, and the army are called back. There's further delay. And then for the third time, they start to come over. This time, it appears that it's finally taking place. Wallace and de Moray's strategy: let enough of them over, enough of the infantry, only so much of the cavalry, and then make their move down the causeway at a march, before going into a trot and levelling their lances at the English.
So Cressingham ultimately made the call to cross. Now, he was a man despised by the Scots. If I've mentioned, they called him the Scots treacherer. And it seems he was a bit of a bully, even on the English side, demanding that they cross and not waste any more of the king's coin.
Cressingham was very much a money-orientated man. He was a taxman, but he was also a very powerful character. And even although de Warrene possibly had rank on him here, they went over with Cressingham, the Knight Marmaduke de Twenge, Richard Waldegrave. De Warrene stays on the other side, and we have to remember that all the time this has been watched from Stirling Castle. They have a great view of what must have been equally confusing to them as it was to Wallace and Moray. But the time has come to cross, and we are on the old stone bridge here. The Stirling Bridge of the battle was some 50 yards plus downstream here that went over a diagonal way. You can see the tide is low here, but you can see the width of the river, and that bridge was only designed, it was a civilian bridge, to take a horse and cart.
Now we reckon, or I've certainly done a few measurements myself, the bridge might have been about 65 metres long. That would take about 120 men to fill it and march in formation, 42 horses. 120 men, you're talking about 9 tonne in armour, roughly 80 kilograms each, you're talking 9 tonne. 42 heavy cavalry horses, you're talking over 20 tonnes of weight on that bridge. Now that would put a significant strain on it, particularly when the panic set in.
That is a major stress for the bridge, just for the crossing alone, which would have been somewhat organised. That is not to consider mass panic when they're trying to get back over the bridge in very different order. And you also have, once the rout was taking place, once the slaughter was taking place, men climbing on the outside of the bridge. That bridge would have been starting to heave, creak back and forth, and the weight was simply going to be far too much. The stress was great, there was no more room on it, and people are trying to somehow cling and climb across it to safety. Horses would have been rearing, knights would have been falling off their horses, people being trampled, sheer and utter chaos.
Now there's been discussion regarding the bridge. Did it collapse, or was it deliberately taken down by the English on one side or the Scots on the other? What's your kind of thoughts on that, Mark?
I think my own opinion is that Wallace or de Moray, we'll just talk about them in combination because Moray deserves his place here, and because he sustained what would be a mortal wound. He's not mentioned as much. I personally don't think, because they didn't know what was going to happen. So what is the sense of cutting the bridge? If that bridge had given way during one of those earlier crossings, it would have scuppered the whole battle plan. I think that because the bridge was designed for a horse and cart, it wasn't designed for heavy military crossing, certainly not designed for war, that the stress on that bridge, due to the panic, due to the rout, was far too great, and it eventually gave way under that massive weight and the shifting of all those weights of horses and knights that are in the utter chaos of battle. That's far too much.
So Max and I we've fought our way down to the banking of the Forth here, and we're in the area where the old wooden bridge of 1297 would have touched the north bank of the River Forth, and where the English would have crossed onto. And importantly, this is the area where the Scots would have had to taken control. So what happened when that happened, Max?
Just to give the viewer an idea of what we have fought through, if you just take a look at the undergrowth there, it's absolutely treacherous to try and even get through this. But what you've got, so you've got the far side of the English bank. Now, this was a diagonal bridge, and it came across the river diagonally. So the English have come across in small numbers at a time. The bridge meets a causeway here. And it's important for the Scots to allow so many over and cut off the bridge. So a detachment would have been sent to attack the bridge and hold it. It wouldn't have taken much holding as long as that detachment wasn't under attack from any soldiers on this side, which the rest of Moray and Wallace's army would have taken care of. So once they seal the bridge, there's just no room to manoeuvre, and that becomes clogged, it becomes jam-packed, and those soldiers on the bridge, both mounted and on foot, and at the other side, they are effectively out of the battle, as long as the Scots can hold this.
Now, Guisborough, one of the chroniclers of the time, he talked about perhaps 100 cavalry got across and 5,000 troops from the English side.
Guisborough's Walter of Guisborough is very interesting chronicle, because Sir Marmaduke de Twang, one of the knights they've crossed here, he's crossed here with his detachment. He's from Kilton Castle, and he lived a stone's throw from Walter of Guisborough, so he has given those stories to the chronicler firsthand. And they reckon about 5,000 English footmen have gotten across here, and with somewhere around 100 cavalry, possibly 150, but no more than that would Wallace and Moray have wanted in. They can match 5,000 foot soldiers and that amount of cavalry.
So it was absolutely critical that they took control of this bridgehead.
No doubt
because
about
the English had considerable numbers on the other bank.
They still had maybe another 250 mounted cavalry, which is a lot. And if they're able to filter through, even at a slow rate, that could have changed the whole course of the battle. The strategy, the military tactics were that we close that bridge.
At all costs.
At all costs, at any cost.
Now, Max, we know that there was a Scottish defector on the English side, and he had an alternative view to where they might cross.
Well, the knight Lundy had joined the English after the capitulation at Irvine, which was a real shame, where Scotland surrendered without a blow, and he knows the area well. He had suggested to Cressingham and de Warrene that if they were to go further downstream where the River Teith meets the River Forth, that there was a ford there. Now, going away down river there, if you're to go to that point today, where the ford is, it's quite incomprehensible because it's wide and it's deep. But Lundy's suggestion was dismissed. Cressingham was anxious to get on, get over, and deal with this rabble.
Really does highlight once again the arrogance of Cressingham.
He was in total control of this battle. De Warrene hated being in Scotland. He didn't even want to be here. Now, he's a battle-hardened veteran, but he is a veteran. His stomach for invading another country and working in that capacity was waning greatly. But Cressingham was anxious to... He was Edward's man. And first and foremost, he wanted to seal coin, territory, and get the job done for Edward I. So he wanted to get over here. He did not take Wallace or de Moray's army seriously. Think of what they did at Dunbar.
Yes.
Think of what he did when de Moray was captured along with the Commons, and he escaped from Chester. He came up and he spearheaded that rebellion in the north where they took Urquhart Castle, Elgin, Banff. They really attacked Dundee with Wallace before they came down here. So to dismiss that army shows the degree of arrogance, because they've already routed Edward's authority up north, and now it's come to a head right here at Stirling.
So once they're across, 100 cavalry, perhaps 5, maybe a little bit more infantry, 5,000 infantry. They have gone onto the causeway. Where have they gone from them, and how has Wallace and de Moray's troops come down to meet them?
The causeway goes for a little way, so it's soft meadowland, which the knights would have been on. But that gives way to hard, fertile ground. It was agricultural land as well. They've gone... Wallace and de Moray would not wanted the English to get too far up that causeway, where they can get room to move and speed to mount any type of cavalry charge. The cavalry have got to be ineffective, and that's why they only let over so many as possible. So we're going to go over there, we're going to take a look at the causeway, and we're going to take a look at where those 5,000 infantry and the English knights congregated, and where they were pressed back into that fatal loop that was sealed by the River Forth.
Well, Max, we've come down onto the grounds of Stirling Rugby Club. This is a flat area between the loop and the river, which is about a distance of 350 metres between the two loops. The Scots have come down the causeway, sealed off the bridge, and now they're pressing into the English. So what happened? What took place in this area, Max?
Well, it's quite fitting that the battle area here is in a rugby ground today, because I would think any young lads playing for the Stirling Rugby County team have got that warrior spirit in this piece of ground, because this is where the most ferocious fighting took place. You're right, they've sent a detachment across to the bridge to stop any more of the English getting over. Yeah. Wallace and Moray have allowed so many over. My own personal opinion is the foot have come over first. They are much easier to get over. Yes. It's much more efficient. It's much quicker. And then the horse have come. Maybe you have in the region of 100 to 150 mounted cavalry. Yep. Over here. Marmaduke, de Twenge among them. Cressingham is over here. Latimer, de Warrene are on the other side, and they are watching this, and they must be aghast at what is going on. So the Scots are attacking ferociously, and they're pushing them back. We have the causeway, which eventually gives way to soft meadow ground, and then that goes on to harder, fertile ground. The Scots don't want them onto the hard ground.
No.
When you have mounted heavy cavalry, you want to keep them on the soft ground, and you want to minimise any movement that they have. So they've come down from Navy Craig, quite a trot. They would have picked up from a march to a trot to come in here before they levelled their spears. And this area here, probably between somewhere around this rugby post right up to where we are standing now, we have the loop of the river. English army, the vast majority of it, the bulk of it, are on the other side, watching their comrades. You have a large proportion of Welsh, which I think would have been sent over as well, the Welsh foot. But they will have known that not many more can get over. They would have heard the carnage at the other side. And remember, they're watching from the castle. What a view. What a view they have had from the castle here. But for the Scots to press in here, and they had something to fight for. If the English were going to do anything, they had to be able to cross that bridge to the gateway to the north.
And just to put into some context, Mark, you're talking about between 100 and 150 cavalry, heavy cavalry. That was a formidable force back in the day, wasn't it?
It certainly was. It doesn't sound a lot to some people. They might think, what, 100, 150? When you have 100, 150 mounted horse that are between 8 and 10 foot high with their rider, the weight of them alone, and if they're able to fight in unison, that is a heck of a brute force coming at you if they're able to get up momentum. And horse of the day were the elite.
Yes.
There was nothing that could move them. There was nothing that could smash them or block them,
Yes.
except sealing off ground. And this was very much in its infancy. The cavalry were it.
So Wallace and de Moray, they would have taken that into account. They've only let so much across. The cavalry's been here, but they've got a strategy in place to deal with that.
They certainly do. And I believe that Moray and Wallace came down here on horseback, stilling their men, keeping them as it to go, and at some point they've got off their horse and they've got into the fighting.
Yeah.
Moray's wounded at some point in the fighting.
Fatally. Fatally. wounded.
Fatally, he would die a few months later, probably gangrenous.
Yes.
An infected wound or something like that. I can just imagine Wallace wading in. He's not going to be at the back. He's going to be first bloodthirsty, wading in. And we know the conversation that we talked about previously when they sent the friars up onto the hill to try and negotiate with Wallace and Moray. We know Wallace's answer there. There's no recording of anything that Moray said. Wallace seems to have taken the bull by the horns in that talk, and he sent them back. So he was here. He's absolutely spoiling for this fight.
Absolutely.
And the Scots' charge would have been extremely aggressive. Get right in there, seal off that ground, and I can only imagine sheer panic, the noise of their comrades on the other side, either shouting support or shouting in confusion. They can't get over the bridge. Warrene must be completely, what do I do? He's watching Cressingham and the rest of the knights. And of course, Cressingham himself, he is pulled down from his horse here, the most hated man in England, bar Edward I.
Yes.
The treacherer, as they refer to him.
Cressingham the treacherer.
No one likes a taxman at the best of the times, but when you have an invader coming in, and Cressingham had written to Edward constantly telling him about the unrest in Scotland, that what they did with their heads was far removed from their hearts.
Exactly.
And Cressingham, that hated man, legend has it that Wallace, that he is brought down, he is butchered, and Wallace has taken a strip of skin from him from head to foot, and he's fashioned a baldric belt for his sword there.
And that was like Wallace sending a message, wasn't it? There is no compromise here. We're fighting for the freedom and liberty of the country. We want you out of our kingdom. He was laying down his marker and said, there's no going back here.
There's no going back. And mutilation in any history,
Absolutely.
mutilation of the enemy, it's part of it, and it's not only propaganda. So however much Cressingham was mutilated or whatever they did, there may be some propaganda to that, but I've got no doubt they would have made a visible example of him. Many of the other soldiers, the foot soldiers, they've gone into the river. If a knight has still mounted, they do not want to leave their horse. Many would have been on the river trying to swim over and get to the other side. We know that Marmaduke de Twang, when the battle was lost, when the fighting was lost, he has gathered some riders with him. He has hacked his way through to get back across the bridge. His nephew, I think it was unhorsed. And he stopped to help pick him up. And Marmaduke de Twang must have been swiping away furiously with his sword or his mace, cutting through the Scots to get back to the bridge. And he actually makes it. He's a phenomenal character in Scottish history, but in this battle, he's absolutely phenomenal. And he would be around for many more fights to come. But what a scene of carnage this must have been. It went terribly wrong for the English.
Absolutely.
And the Scots absolutely pulled it off. I think part of it was intelligent strategy, and the rest, opportunism. And when you take an opportunity that presents itself.
And that would have been viewed by horror, as you say. The castle, it's almost like it's overlooking an arena down here.
Yeah.
They would have had a clear view of the carnage that was taking place here, and their troops effectively been massacred, pushed back into the fort, and they would have been panic-stricken up there.
Absolutely panic-stricken. Because once this is dealt with,
Yes.
once these are all killed, there's no prisoners here.
No.
There's no prisoners. You're caught on this side. You're clinging to life until someone deals with that. Then they're coming for it.
Yeah.
They're coming for it. And then we have the question about the bridge.
Yes.
The bridge itself.
Shall we take a walk around the field here?
Let's do that.
We fought our way through the dense undergrowth here, down to the River Forth. The tide is just ebbing its way out just now. We're opposite the Stirling Rowing Club boathouse over there, and the castle is in the background. So what took place here, Max?
Well, as we can see, the tide is out, but what you're seeing is the width of the river. Now, that is really strong, but when there's a current going in there, and of course the water is higher. The English with the Warrene, with Surrey, are on the other side, but they're looking at their comrades here, and a good proportion of the Welsh. And once the battle is slipping, the temptation, of course, is to flee and to get over the river, but there's also the sense of duty that you have because your comrades are falling around you, they need your support. You've got to group together and fight. So some would have died until the mass panic took place. Some are coming down here for their lives. It would have, okay, not as dense as it is now for the month it was, but that's one heck of a prospect.
Absolutely.
And the Scots know that driving them back into the river, I've no doubt that some knights would have come down here in horse and tried it.
Yeah. But given the fact that they're in armour and heavy protective gear, that is not an easy crossing.
That is not an easy crossing. No. Nothing's easy, but when your life's in jeopardy, it's most of the knights are going to try and hack their way through, as Marmaduke de Twing did at the bridge. But this is going to be strewn with bodies. There's no room to get back across the bridge, so that you're going to have dead bodies and you're going to have live people trying to get over to the other side to safety. It's a lost cause at this point.
Some accounts have given figures in the region of 5,000 to 6,000 English killed. What's your own thoughts on that?
There's one record that states that they lost about 100 cavalry.
Yes.
So around that, which is a heavy loss.
Oh yes,
that's a heavy loss. When you consider the cost of a war horse.
Yes.
And they may have lost that many knights.
Yeah.
Cavalry knights. As far as there would not be many foot survivors that got over here, so I reckon a couple of thousand.
Yeah.
Along with maybe 100 to 150 horse.
Significant.
That is more than enough for the Scots to chew on, to attack. The Scots haven't taken advantage of a small number. They want to make a dent. They want to make a statement with this English army. So they've allowed enough across where a good fight can take place. But the Scots, they've controlled this. And we were talking earlier on about structure. It's been a very tactical battle from the Scots. It's not just been, I mean, the Schiltrons have held. They have to hold to be able to press them back. If the Schiltrons separate and they become individual spearmen, even although they're close to each other, they need to be closely packed to drive them back. And so the Scots have kept form.
Absolutely.
They have kept battle formation there. And even while the fight is going on, there are instructions taking place. And of course, for the English, it's chaos. It's chaos. They are in the jaws of death right there.
I agree with you on that, because the timing of the battle, the Scots locking off the bridgehead and then coming down onto here and pushing them back was quite crucial, because if they hadn't secured that bridge, it would be easy for the English to come round the back and outflank them.
Absolutely.
So that was crucial. And it may have been the first time we see the Schiltrons in action against the cavalry. And that became before the Flemish and Courtrai. So who knows? It might be a case that they learnt something from us. And of course Wallace used it at Falkirk, and then Bruce to great effect at Bannockburn.
Of course they did.
Because it was rare, very rare in European history that foot soldiers ever defeated cavalry at that point.
Absolutely. That's why it's crucial
Yes.
that you only let a certain amount of cavalry over. If they hadn't managed to secure the bridge,
Yep.
hypothetically,
Yes.
just imagine another 15 to 20 mounted knights were able to get over. They can do a lot of damage.
Very much so.
20 mounted knights they can turn the tide.
Yep.
And so it was crucial that the knights that they had here were boxed in, they were dealt with,
Yep.
and the rest were out of the picture.
Now, when news of this English defeat got to Edward I, the King of England, he was furious, wasn't he?
Edward was very much, if you want a job done right, you do it yourself. Yeah. He was furious. He would have been absolutely livid. Of course, he's heard of this Wallace. Yeah. Wallace has previously, with the insurrection at Lanark, he's murdered a man of authority. He's taken it a level further. There were disturbances all over the place. And Edward's confidence that Scotland was brought to heel was premature.
Yes.
Edward had dusted himself down. Even Clifford and Percy were saying, Scotland's no problem now. Yes. There's no problem anymore. Yeah. They did not expect this. And it
brings back the old saying to mind, doesn't it? Beaten but never defeated.
Yes. And we have to remember, just prior to this, Wallace and Moray have been laying siege to Dundee.
Yes, that's right.
And so they have sent this army north, and they've come down here to meet them. So they've gotten here well before that. Yes. They've planned this, and they've executed it brilliantly.
So there's been insurrection all throughout Scotland. Mm-hmm. The people are up in arms about the taxation and the overbearing rule of the English. There's disruption throughout the country from up Aberdeen, Banff, down to Galloway. They fought at Dundee and then have come down here. And this has been the kind of final push to get any effective fighting English force out of Scotland. Yeah.
No one likes an invader.
Wow.
And the Scots are only too well aware of how Edward dealt with the Welsh.
Yes.
And how he tamed the dragon and brought the Welsh into his fold. And he would have had the same designs for Scotland.
Absolutely.
That we're going to fight for him in France at his will. And that's what started a lot of the trouble in the first place. Stripping John Balliol and conscripting the men. So, no, this is a severe bloody nose, and it's obviously got Edward's attention. Yeah. And for Edward now, this is war.
Yeah, out and out. So here we are in conclusion, Max. We've walked around the battlefield of Stirling Bridge in 1297. We've come up onto the Abbey Craig.
What a view.
Absolutely fantastic. And to look back on the life of William Wallace and why we commemorate him. But he certainly packed a lot into the years between 1297 when he first came on the scene, when he slayed the Sheriff of Lanark, and then between 1305 when he was executed at Smithfield in London. He packed so much into that short period of time.
Yeah, Wallace was in many ways a shooting star. He came, he appeared, and he was gone as quick as he was. But after the Battle of Stirling Bridge and the English fleeing south, Wallace would raid into Durham, and the English, if his name wasn't known largely in part before then, it certainly was afterwards, because his savagery was particularly noted with Lanark. He would lay waste to the land, and it's great that we have this statue, and I sometimes wonder if Wallace was able to come back and look at this statue, what he would make of it.
And this monument, of course, is the largest monument or memorial to any single person in the UK. that's an impact that he's had on people through the centuries.
It really has, and everywhere else you go to the town of Lanark, his statue dominates the town centre, where he really, after he murdered the Sheriff of Lanark, his statue at Dryborough, where he overlooks the Eildon Hills and the route south that the English would have come. He's standing watch over there. He became larger than life. And although it's very important to remember William Wallace, of course there was much more to the Wallace family than William. He had a brother called John who was captured a year after William, and he was taken to London and he was executed in exactly the same way. And not much is said of John or even known about John, but John Wallace was executed for his part in the Bruce Rebellion. We also have his brother Malcolm and his father Alan.
And we know, of course, that they were in the Bruce camp. In 1299, they were in the Bruce camp. So it's interesting to know what might have happened with Wallace and Bruce had that future ever come around.
It's really intriguing that they were in the Bruce camp, because Wallace was through and through, by all accounts, a Balliol man. He fought for the restoration of John Balliol, who was very closely linked to the Bruce adversaries, the Commons.
Right.
So when the Commons went up against Edward, Bruce was very much in Edward's camp then, and even at the Battle of Dunbar. It's but this is a phenomenal place to come, and even although modern development has taken its toll, when you look out here on the battlefield from up here in Abbeycrag, you can get a real sense of place of what Wallace and de Moray were looking at and when they decided to make their move. But Battle of Stirling Bridge, of course, he was made guardian of Scotland after that. He really rose to prominence.
Wow.
What a position to have. But what he was really up against was not just the English. It was not just Edward. It was the volatile political nature of Scotland of the day, the nobles. They would support him, but they would kind of take a step back and let him get on with it. And of course, when things went sour after his defeat at Falkirk, no matter where you try to lay the blame, you see the true nature of the nobles, don't we?
It's been said that the nobles fought with both their head and their heart.
Yeah.
They looked after their interests, their land, their money, and they would go on either side wherever it suited them. But you can consider Wallace, I guess, as an original Scottish patriot, because he bent the knee to no man, didn't he?
He was uncompromising.
He was his own man, he was loyal to Scotland and the men that fought for him, and he was totally uncompromising with whomever he dealt with on the Scottish or the English side.
And he was also a powerful character, as well as an intimidating one. And you can see why the nobles maybe had this friction with Wallace, particularly the Commons, in my opinion, who would have had mixed feelings of Wallace. As long as he's successful, let him go with it. But in the very end, Edward had stopped chasing Wallace. Edward was not sending his own forces after Wallace. He left that to the Scots nobles. You bring me him, or the deals are off.
Yes.
But a shooting star who put Scottish rebellion on the map, put his name on the map, and as you say, Scotland's national son. And when we think of freedom, and we think of not being ruled by a foreign invader, the name William Wallace is the first thing that comes to mind.
Well, that's right, and quite rightly remembered on the anniversary of the battle today. He is a source of civic and national pride to be remembered, commemorated, and to look to the future as well as a way of going forward. We remember the past, don't we? And it's people like Wallace who have made us into the people in the nation we are today. So very, very important that we do commemorate and remember the deeds of the past, and particularly the Battle of Stirling Bridge.
Absolutely. Most definitely.
Well, it's been a pleasure, Mark.
A pleasure
It's been
working with you, Mark.
A great day. So thank you. I look forward to more.